Hi, everyone, and welcome to my sci-fi, fantasy, and horror short fiction roundup featuring 17 awesome stories I read in December 2020. It's been a crazy week in the world, um, but I'm just going to disregard that for right now. Um, and I'm going to dig right into these awesome stories. So, my first pick for this month's roundup is The Little Witch by M. Rickert at Tor.com. This is a story that came out last fall, but I didn't read it until now. The introduction blurb for this story says, every Halloween, an elderly woman hands out candy to a young trick-or-treater who's dressed as a witch, each time looking exactly the same age. With each passing year, the woman grows more attached to the little witch and her odd nature, but she is no ordinary child, and an uncanny relationship develops between the two of them that may prove dangerous and deadly. Now, I love this story with all my witch-adoring heart. It's an absolutely fantastically creepy yet charming, how about that combo, story that starts out by anchoring itself quite solidly in the real world as we know it, and then proceeds to quietly and deliberately twist that real world and turn it upside down and inside out. At first, it seems it's just the little girl who is uncanny, yet we realize bit by bit that there is a heck of a lot more going on here than that. This is brilliant dark fiction by Rickert. My next story pick is The Wrong Girl by Angela Slater in Nightmare magazine. I'll start with a quote from this story. Ilsa stares at Will a moment longer. His face writes checks that his nature can't cash, she thinks, watching as he blushes, eyes flicker down, those thick lashes seeming to take a bow. Such a pretty face. A chilling horror story from the masterful Angela Slater that cuts deep into the dark heart of relationships between friends, siblings, and lovers. Will is a man who mistreats all the women in his life and who is unable to see his own shortcomings with any real clarity. His friend, Ilsa, on the other hand, sees through him with unsettling ease. She's kept her distance from him, resisting his advances that they should be together, but then Will finds a way to wheedle his way into her home anyway, with disastrous, tragic results. A cold-blooded tale with a terrifying and satisfying ending. My next pick is Let Shadows Slip Through by Callie Napier in New Gothic Review. A taut, tense, and thoroughly gripping piece of dark fiction that twists ever deeper into darkness and horror as you read it. It starts out as a tale about a woman on the road with her young son, and while you realize very soon that everything is definitely not okay, there's a specific turn at the end that gave me the best kind of chills. Excellent story. My next story pick is The Last Bookseller of St. Paul by Jordan Hirsch in Apparition Lit. Now, in a future version of St. Paul, Minnesota, Alabelle uses what remains of the once mighty Mississippi River to deliver books to buyers. The world, the climate, society, and the people in it, including Alabelle, have changed in subtle and drastic ways after a catastrophic event called the Fallout. But Alabelle is determined to keep her book business going. I love this story for many reasons, including the authors mentioned as Alabelle is going through her book inventory, but maybe especially for the way it sees a way forward, not just in spite of the changes the world has undergone, but also because of them. There's a wonderful gleam of hope at the end. My next story pick is Renovation of a Finite Apartment by Toby McNutt in Strange Horizons. Now this is a very strange, very deep, and utterly beguiling story about a being that is living among humans in a human body, but who is decidedly not human inside that human skin. Like, never spells out in so many words what kind of being exactly we're dealing with here, but it really doesn't matter. What matters is the searing loneliness and profound feeling of being other and lost that pervades every facet of this being's existence in our world. I love the way the story looks at human beings from the outside, and I love the quiet, piercing voice of the alien protagonist telling us their story. My next story pick is Open 27 Hours by L.P. Kindred in Speculative Cities Afrofuturism issue. Now, prepare to get very hungry while reading this story. It starts out with a young woman who is talking to her friends about amazing dishes they've eaten, and she mentions Nobovgo casserole. She remembers the dish distinctly and remembers that it was the last meal she shared with her mother, but she cannot remember where she ate it. As it turns out, one of her friends says she knows exactly where she ate that dish. And what follows after this revelation is no ordinary restaurant visit. This is a wonderful, magical story about food and family, friends, and memories. My next story pick is And the Ones Who Walk In by Sarah Avery in Beneath Ceaseless Skies. Sarah Avery's story is a thoughtful, finely crafted tale inspired by, and I guess something of a sequel to, Ursula K. Le Guin's famous The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, published in 1973, which is probably one of the most famous fantasy short stories. Here, we follow a young woman who has decided to leave Omelas, though the city is never named that in Avery's text, and soon realizes that the world outside this blessed city, which is blessed, of course, by the horrific hardships inflicted on a child kept in that city, that the world outside is no easy place to navigate, and that when you've made up your mind that you cannot live with the injustice you left behind, it doesn't mean necessarily that it's easy to navigate that outside world. I love the carefully crafted fantasy world that Avery's characters move through, and I love how Avery interrogates the challenges of that outside world and what happens to all the walkers who have decided through the years to walk away from the blessed city, so-called. This is a great tale in its own right, especially when Crocus, the protagonist, meets a woman with a baby and finds out that some people are doing all they can to get to the place Crocus left behind. My next story pick is What My Flies Keep for Me by Shaoni C. White in Podcastle, and it's narrated by Abra Stephen Wiebe. I'm starting with a quote from the story. There's a dead body on the floor. This is a bad thing. I'm having trouble recalling why that's the case, but I'm sure it'll come back to me soon. I fastidiously clean the blade of the knife on the shirt that the body is wearing because the knife is my brother's, and it's rude to return things you borrowed in poor condition. That's what the flies resting on the curve of my ear are telling me. End quote. Now, I'm a sucker for stories that take a really far-out premise and just runs with it and makes it compelling in its absolute strangeness and weirdness. Here we find ourselves in a world where insects, bees, ants, flies, belong in some way to a person and keep a part of their personality, a part of them outside their body. It's a fascinating way to externalize part of a person's personality and reflect on what we might be like if that part of us was missing. Here, someone has stolen the protagonist's flies, the ones that keep, well, an integral part of them. What part that is part of the mystery to be figured out. I adore this story. It's strong and compelling, and I particularly love how the world looks to the protagonist when they have lost that one vital part of themselves, and how the world changes when that part and the flies return. My next story pick is This Is How You Remember by Fong Quan at Cast of Wonders, narrated by Andrew K. Ho and Rashida Priolo. This is an epic, sprawling space opera in short story format. Kwan's science fiction tale plunges us deep into a future and a universe full of huge battles, strange aliens, friends and enemies, death, loss, grief, and love. Because in addition to being a tale about war and space battles, this is very much a story about the deep love and friendship between the alien speaker, Al, and the human, John. They went through a lot together, but when they meet up on Earth again, in John's childhood home, after a long time apart, nothing between them is the way it used to be. I love the intricate world building here and the characters, and I adore the whole universe it's set in. Over on Twitter, Kwan calls it a post-colonial military SF space opera about war, love, loss, and diaspora with Asian American characters. My next story is The Skin of Aquila Cadence by Chris Panettiere in Metaphorosis magazine. A scientist has traveled to a planet in the Vega star system, giving up many years of her life on that trip in order to study the results of her research in person. The aim of the research is to find new worlds for humans to inhabit by sending genetically engineered bugs to several exoplanets. Some of the bugs are supposed to perform various terraforming tasks, while some are meant to occupy any native species they find and modify them in ways that are beneficial for humans. Now, this is a quiet, fascinating story about life and science and about what we might choose to do with our lives when we find ourselves growing old, far from home. I love how this story gets progressively stranger and more intimate as it goes, and by the end, it is literally transformative. My next story pick is Fear of Lying by M. Darusha Wem at Toasted Cake, narrated by Tina Connolly. This is a wonderful slice of sci-fi flash about a negotiator from Earth tasked with working out a bargain with an alien species. Both sides want something from the other, but the problem is that the aliens don't exactly negotiate the way humans are used to. I love the wry sense of humor as the negotiator contemplates this conundrum. Also, Connolly is a wonderful narrator, as always, and this story was originally published on Wem's Patreon. My next story pick is True Love by Sarah Pinsker at Escape Pod, narrated by Mur Lafferty. I love this near-future sci-fi story about a new device that helps people find their perfect match and what happens when the True Love company sets up an event at a small bar called Meat Spates, where Molly works. It's a quiet story, but insightful and with a real sense of humor, and I love how human it is, how it includes a new technology, but never loses the human perspective. Even if it's about tech, on the surface, it's really about human beings and how lives can be affected by how we choose or choose not to use new technology and apps. My next story pick is The State Machine by Yudhanyaya Wijeratna and Slate Futures. I really like stories that take the old AIs are bad and will destroy us trope and do something new with that premise, and that's exactly what Wijeratna does in this story. Yes, the artificial intelligence that is basically running society in the story is problematic, to be sure, but it might not be bent on destroying humanity. It's a deep and thoughtful take on artificial intelligence and society in the future. My next story pick is An Indefinite Number of Birds by Kurt Hunt in Fantasy Magazine. The return of Fantasy Magazine has been great news for SFF fiction, and so far they've published some really profound, wrenching pieces, often with a dark vein pulsing through them, and that's also the case for this story by Kurt Hunt. The story is a love story that delves deep into the misunderstandings, misfiring communication, and unspoken insecurities that can seriously fracture a relationship. It's a sharp, heart-piercing story. My next story pick is Felt Along the Seam by Kelly Sandoval in Flash Fiction Online. And I'll start for the opening line, which is, I'm standing in the school bathroom peeling off a ghost when the new girl walks in. Peeling off ghosts is how Brooke in the story deals with pain, the pain and darkness in her life. Usually no one really notices what she's doing, but Ash, the new girl, does notice. They become friends and maybe something more to each other, and there's a solace in that for both of them. And then Ash asks Brooke to teach her that trick of peeling off the ghosts. This is a gentle, profoundly moving story about friendship and adolescence and how we deal or not deal with the pain we encounter in life. My next story pick is Daughters of October by Megan Chaudhuri in Cosmas Infinities number 3. This story is set in an alternate history version of our world where the Second World War played out a lot differently and the Americans were defeated by the Soviets in 1957, and where the emergence of superheroes born by human mothers played a part in the war effort. It's an intricate and fascinating alt history world that is the backdrop here for a suspenseful, thrilling story about Vera, her daughter Katerina, who is pregnant with a baby who may or may not be a superhero. It's a rich, wonderfully layered story that kept me on the edge of my seat from start to finish. And I love how it tells the story of a larger world by telling a very small focused story about family and about what we might risk in a repressive society in order to save the ones we love. My final story pick for this month's Roundup is Iterations by Christian Monson in Mythila Review. This is a story that was published a while ago, and I just got around to reading it finally. And I think I've mentioned before that I love sci-fi with screwed up timelines and non-linear time, and when we're dealing with multiple realities. And this story has all that. It starts out as a seemingly straightforward tale about a couple going hunting on an alien planet led by a guide who has some backstory with the wife of the couple. The alien wildlife includes a very strange creature that is so dangerous that everyone tries to avoid confronting it. But once that confrontation inevitably happens in the story, well, we're off on one heck of a wild ride. It's a hugely entertaining roller coaster of a story, and I just love the twists and turns it takes. And those are all my story picks for this month. And thanks for listening. Thanks for reading, and I'll be back next month with another Roundup. Thank you.